Hello, everybody, and welcome to Haaretz Insider, an exclusive online event for Haaretz.com subscribers. Joining us today for this special pre-election webinar, we have Allison, Kaplan, Sommer. Hi, Allison.
Hey, Simon.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Chemi Shalev, looking very dapper, Chemi. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, and just for the record, this is Haaretz Insider, and not as someone on the production team seems to think, Haaretz Insider. But I think we'll raise a glass to the misunderstanding anyway, before we get going. L'chaim.
L'chaim. Cheers. Happy New Year. Yeah.
To free and unfettered elections.
Amen. Okay, let's start with the questions. We got this one in from Donna Halper, who wants to know whether the Israeli media has become nothing more than Benjamin Netanyahu's lapdog, and whether it still has the ability to speak truth to power. She refers in her question to the involvement of Republican mega-donor Sheldon Adelson in the Israeli media and Netanyahu's semi-successful attempts to muzzle anyone in the media who opposes him. Chemi, do you feel muzzled?
I don't feel muzzled. I work for a newspaper that maintains independence and which, frankly, Netanyahu has not spent all that much effort and time in order to muzzle, because I think he views us and our readers as lost causes, so he doesn't bother with us. But it's true that the Israeli media landscape is changing, and it's changing in a rightward direction. There are already several large media outlets that are beholden to Netanyahu, and the others, even though they are fighting for their independence, a lot of them are doing so while they fend off Netanyahu's attempts to either change their ownership or pressure them into. So generally speaking, the situation is not as bad as mentioned in the question, but it's bad enough. And I'm assuming that if Netanyahu wins these elections with his 61 majority that he's looking for, the situation is going to get much worse. Netanyahu, if you saw him in his interviews in the past 24 hours, he spends a lot of time maligning the media, and it comes from a very deep place within him. So I don't think this is one of his campaign ploys, of which he's deployed many. And I think that when he, and we know from the past 3 years, from the criminal investigations, that he is obsessed with getting positive coverage in the media. I don't expect that to stop if he wins the elections, but on the contrary.
Allison, do you feel there's been any impingement on the freedom of the Israeli press?
I don't know if like direct impingement, but there's certainly plenty of manipulation going on and outright sort of threatening, incitement, calling for boycotting of television stations, etc.
And then giving an interview to that same channel.
Absolutely. And in this round of elections, Chemi, I'm interested if you agree, it seems like because he doesn't really have a very substantial opponent to lash out on, somebody he can really, plaster as a leftist, and someone he can really smear because the smears aren't sticking to Benny Gantz's primary competitor. So in a way, he's, Trump style, he's running against the media. That's sort of the enemy that he can set up to push against. And there's been some criticism that the media is playing into his hands. That when he's decided to do this last-minute blitz before the election, in the past 48 hours, how many interviews has he given? A lot, in which many of them he's basically shouting over his interviewer and giving a campaign speech instead of actually answering their questions.
I think it's true that Benny Gantz does not present the kind of target that Netanyahu would like. He's not a Shimon Peres or a Ehud Barak. He's not flamboyant enough, and he hasn't done anything actually in politics other than his army service. There's not much to latch onto. There have been attempts to undermine or to try to cast doubt on Gantz's stability, let's say. But it's true, one, that he has made the media his foil, and that didn't start now. That started already a while ago. And he is emulating Trump in that, but much more so in his ability to totally dominate the media by producing constant provocations and news and using his pulpit as the prime minister in order to produce news. A lot of it fake news, but it still makes the headlines. And his opponents are looking on helplessly as he dominates the airwaves and necessarily dwarfs them in comparison.
And the narrative, of course. And he started this election campaign with a big billboard saying they won't decide, and photos of several important Israeli journalists.
Right.
A related question from Abraham Simhoni's come in. He's asking why Haaretz doesn't openly back a specific party, why it doesn't endorse a party in the upcoming elections, as most national and regional newspapers in the US do. Now, I've asked this question before, and the answer I've been given is that we can't agree amongst the editorial board which party we should vote for. But I understand that something's changed.
We've been told to stay tuned, that on election eve that Haaretz will endorse at least one party. And if the past is any indication, Haaretz has endorsed parties in previous years. I think that they like to wait until the very last day, until the very last moment to do it. I guess, in order not to unduly influence too long before the election, or maybe just to wait till the last minute to see what happens and be absolutely sure in their endorsement.
Who would you like to see us endorsing?
We can't. I'd just like to point out that the questioner is probably referring mainly to American newspapers who endorse candidates. But he has to remember that in America there's a two-party system, so it's quite easy. You're either for or against. We, on the left, for example, the center left, or the population that is represented by Haaretz readers, we have four parties to choose from, or four theoretical parties to choose from the Joint Arab List on the left to Kahol Lavan on the center right. And so, and I think all four parties, voting for any of these four parties, serves the goals that Haaretz is promoting and stands for. So, even though they are going to make a suggestion, I think it's quite clear that if you support the center left, any of the parties that you vote for is a vote in the right direction.
It would be a statement, though, from Haaretz to endorse a party or two parties. Let's move on to the next question. Rafael Koslovsky says that there are several leading players amongst the parties who are claiming that they will under no circumstances join a Likud coalition led by Netanyahu. What are the chances there'll be U-turns after the election, and who's most likely to betray, as our questioner puts it, his promises?
Well, there have already been U-turns, right? I mean, Benny Gantz has gone from basically, if not completely ruling out joining Likud, to openly saying that that's the kind of government he wants. He says he wants a secular coalition without the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox parties, with Likud and with Avigdor Lieberman's party. So he's already U-turned. We don't know if he will re-U-turn. What he is saying, though, is that he will only join with Likud without Benjamin Netanyahu at the top. That is something that I could picture him doing a U-turn on. I don't know if you agree.
Look, I don't know whether he'll do a U-turn. The fact is, first of all, that all of these statements are simply posturing, because on the day after, when we know what the results of the elections are, first of all, nothing that the candidates have said so far really binds them, and second of all, we have the actual reality to deal with, because right now they're just talking theory. There are only two parties on the left that completely rule out a coalition with Netanyahu, which is the Arab List and Meretz with Ehud Barak. And I think all the other parties...
The Democratic Union, technically.
Right. under various circumstances, could join a Netanyahu government. I think everybody realizes that. There is, though, the caveat that both the two parties that may join a Netanyahu government, which is Kahol Lavan and Labor, would not stay in his government unless if he's indicted. So that's already an issue, and they would not support, and I think this is Netanyahu's greater concern, they would not support granting him immunity. And we all know, or we all think, that that's his main purpose in these elections, is to somehow find a way to avert the long arm of the law.
That leads on quite nicely to a question from Daniel Sachs, who wants to ask about the process by which Likud could dump Netanyahu in order to remain in power with one of the other parties that's ruled him out personally. Is that possible? And is there even a successor waiting in the wings in the Likud?
Well, there is a successor. There is one successor that everybody speaks of, which is Gideon Sa'ar, who is the only top Likud figure who can somehow claim that he opposed Netanyahu. It all depends on the results of the elections. The moment Netanyahu fails to get his 61 majority, the moment that the president picks on Benny Gantz to form the next government on the assumption that such a thing will happen, then there will start a new dynamic in the Likud. And I don't even know how Netanyahu will react to such a situation, which is in effect means that he's lost the elections. But the common expectation is that everything is now on hold until it becomes clear whether Netanyahu gets his 61 or doesn't. If he doesn't, there's going to be rumblings in the Likud.
There are already rumblings, but the question is,
they'll come out into the open.
Yeah, there are already rumblings under the table.
They'll come out into the open, and that's when a fight might start. But it won't happen before that because everybody in the Likud is concerned that he will get his 61. He'll be crowned a god by the Likud base, and anybody who raises his voice against him under those circumstances will see his political career end.
I don't know the Likud rules and regulations, but does Netanyahu have the power to repress a vote for a new leader if a majority of the party wants a new leader?
No. If there's a central committee, and if it decides to hold primaries, then there will be primaries. And I think there's even a clause that if their candidate loses, they need to hold new primaries. And I don't think that he will run in them. But of course, the question is whether there is a majority that will, oppose him and not follow his word as they do today.
Mm-hmm. I guess we'll have to see if they get to their 61 or not.
Yeah. Well, that's the $61 million question.
Rachel Bluefarb wants to know what's going to happen if Netanyahu can't build a right-wing coalition. What's the most likely scenario for the next, how long could it take, 40 days before we're forced into a third election?
Well, there have been some indications that this time around, President Ruvi Rivlin plans to be more proactive if such a case arises. There have been some reports that he may be much more active in pushing, pressuring, using whatever leverage he has in order to be able to hand the government coalition forming power to another person, presumably Gantz, although it could be somebody else in the Likud, in order to prevent, heaven forbid, a third election.
Well, so we could end up with a very odd coalition under those circumstances, no? With strange bedfellows from left and right and centre and ultra-Orthodox and secular. If Gantz has to try and scramble after Netanyahu's failed to form, it's going to lead to a very strange coalition, wouldn't you think?
Well, first of all, if Netanyahu doesn't get a 61, there's a whole new dynamic which is very difficult to predict because we don't really know what's going to happen in the Likud. If there is a move, if he resigns, or if there is a movement to depose him and it's successful, the most natural partnership is going to be between this Likud under a new leader and Benny Gantz.
Right.
But you also have to take into account that as Israeli elections are peculiar, as we saw on April 9th, and that we could have elections and there's no winner. So we could find ourselves straight back in the situation where we were. And then the question is, under these circumstances, will Netanyahu again prevent Gantz from being picked by the president and go for third elections? Everybody is swearing off such a possibility. Netanyahu was much more hesitant when he was asked about it in his interviews.
But if you look at the polls today and you look at the high number of votes that the Likud and Kahol Lavan has, and you look at the numbers and the math, it's almost hard to imagine how Benny Gantz could possibly put together a coalition without the Likud, because as you said, strange bedfellows. It's impossible to imagine, for example, him bringing Lieberman and the Arab joint list into the same coalition. So when you look at the numbers, Benny Gantz doesn't really have 61 if he doesn't get the Likud on his side.
Well, first of all, I think he is planning on or hoping that that will be possible, and I would not rule out a possibility that he would also bring in Yemina into such a coalition.
Okay, that's possible.
He could have a coalition from Labor without to Yemina, Lieberman, excluding the Likud if Netanyahu is still on top. And he could also, and this is a dicey situation for him, he could reach the same kind of agreement with the Arab parties that Yitzhak Rabin had. Meaning, Yitzhak Rabin signed the political, people forget, he signed a political deal after his 1992 win in which the Arab parties promised to support him from the outside in case of a no-confidence vote, and he gave them in exchange all sorts of... So it is possible to incorporate it's not right to rule them out completely as a factor in forming a new coalition, but I think you're right. I think that if these are the election results and we have two big parties, then the most possible coalition is the one between the two of them. Interestingly, if the two of them get together, they could bypass Lieberman, who would be the reason
Right.
that they're forming this coalition.
And
in
the reason
first
we've
place.
had 2 elections in a
Exactly.
row, right? Yeah.
I mean, between themselves, at these numbers, they could form their own coalition.
But that theoretical coalition that included Lieberman and Yamina, one could hardly call a center-left coalition or even a center coalition. It would still be a center-right coalition without Likud.
I think that, yes, of
Yeah.
course. But I think that the main component of Kahol Lavan, or at least the half of Kahol Lavan, not the Yair Lapid,
It's former
would
Likud.
view that kind of government as way preferable to anything else if it includes Netanyahu. Their dream coalition is with Likud, but if Netanyahu remains on top, I don't see it happening.
We have a couple of questions about voter turnout or lack thereof. Ronnie Feldman says that he gets the sense that there's an atmosphere in this election that people aren't going to bother. Are not going to bother to vote. That's Ronnie's impression. And he'd like to know who these people who aren't voting are and which parties.
Everybody
I'm sure
would
the
like to know
parties
that.
would like to know as well. And William Daroff quotes you, Chemi, as slamming the quinoa eating.
Yeah,
quinoa.
he was miffed by this.
Eating
He apparently
Tel Aviv
eats a lot of
residents.
quinoa.
So can we discuss who's more likely to vote and not to vote, and whether the efforts of the parties to turn out the vote on election day are being successful or not?
I'll mention my unscientific, anecdotal discussions with people who are considering not voting, which is obviously not any based on data.
Yeah.
I have spoken with several traditional Likud voters who still very much want to vote for Likud. Likud is in their blood, in their veins. They are done with Netanyahu. They're tired of Netanyahu, and this inner debate of I can't vote for anybody besides Likud, but I don't want to vote for Bibi is leading them to say that they're considering not voting. Now we don't know if at the last minute that will change and they'll go sort of on automatic pilot and vote anyway. On the left, people who are traditional either labor voters or Meretz voters who are confused / disgusted by the sort of dance that's been done leading up to this election where labor is teaming up with Gesher, which is a step to the right, so they don't feel comfortable voting for labor. And Meretz voters who are very uncomfortable with voting for Ehud Barak, who has joined with Meretz for reasons of his record, saying that we don't have a negotiating partner. They see him more towards the center / right than the Meretz party that they like to support, and some misgivings about his ties with Jeffrey Epstein. Has figures in there somewhere, not dominant. So I see a lot of sort of confused people who are saying, well, maybe I just can't decide who to vote for, so I'm not going to vote for at all. These are small numbers. I think the most significant factors are in the Arab-Israeli population. Those are going to be the big, the most consequential numbers of decisions of voter turnout.
Do you think Netanyahu's done enough to depress voter turnout in the Arab sector with all of his camera laws and what have you?
I have no idea, I admit, whether he is achieving what he meant to achieve or whether he's achieving the opposite. It's true that in the April election, the participation rate of Arabs went down to 49%, which is very low even by their low standards. But that was also because many people were disappointed that they were not running jointly in a joint list, which is not the case now. And so I do not rule out the possibility that his tactics will backfire, and that because there is a joint list, the Arab participation rate will grow back to what it was in 2015 elections, which is 65%, which would give the center-left bloc, if you want to call it that, 2 additional seats. I think that there is another group which is the greater unknown than the Arabs, and that is anybody who we don't know, meaning we know that ultra-Orthodox are going to come 90%. Right. We know that settlers and their supporters are going to come 90%. And so what we're left with are people that are neither, meaning the great mass majority of Israelis who are secular or traditional. They're not necessarily anti-religious. And I think that is what we don't know. And I also think that is what troubles Netanyahu. And if there is a genuine element of hysteria in the hysteria that he's producing, I can only deduce that he has indications that his crowd, people who live in, not so much in central Tel Aviv, but in the periphery, in development towns, they are not showing the kind of enthusiasm that would guarantee his election. And that's why he's prodding them and firing them up. And then there is the quinoa-eating leftist Tel Avivis who traditionally go to the beach and who get interviewed every election and they say there's nobody to vote for and there's no difference between the two. And I think that, at least my anecdotal evidence, is that there is that the danger of the left, this kind of leftist, metropolitan leftist, staying away, millennial, I think is overblown. I think there is a movement of shaming people who are not going to go to vote, and I would not be surprised if on election day it turns out that this myth of the Tel Avivians not giving, not caring about the elections, I don't think it's going to be true. Now, then the question really is how Netanyahu's voters, whether they come to the polls or not, because if they don't come to the polls in the same numbers, we could have a surprise on our hands.
I'm afraid I can't read the name of the person who wrote this, but he or she would like to know whether we expect Gantz to invite the Arabs into the government in any form if he wins.
No.
No.
Beyond the pale, to borrow a phrase from a different world?
No. As I said, he might reach some, under certain circumstances, he might reach some sort of political agreement with them, which would ensure their support. But they would not want, and I don't think they'd want, even though their leader, Ayman Odeh, indicated that under certain conditions they would, but the conditions are not something that Gantz will be able to meet anyway. And it's just Israel is not mature enough, I would say, to include the Arabs in the government yet.
Although Gantz was asked about this in one of his interviews, and he gave a more nuanced answer. He said that the joint list, if it included the Balad party, would be out of consideration, and then there was a follow-up question as to whether if Balad was not the Balad party, the most extreme of the four Arab parties, was not in the equation, and he did not give that a definitive no. So who knows? But I just don't see the joint list breaking up, in order to enter the government.
No, what I also heard him say is that he would be willing to contemplate civilian cooperation or civilian agreement on civilian matters. I think he's talking about this kind of side agreement with the Arabs. He said he would be willing to contemplate civilian agreement, but not political partnership, which means to me that he is leaving open the possibility of setting up a government, say, Lieberman, Labor, Gantz, and to get it into power, he will rely on the Arabs voting confidence in the government without incorporating them physically inside the government.
Professor Joe Gale has another Kahol Lavan, blue and white question. He says that originally they appeared to be Israel's last great hope, but they recently appeared on television together, the four leaders of the party, to declare that if they were in power, they would finish off Hamas and conquer the Gaza Strip in a day or two. So his question is, do you or they or anyone know what they would do with the 1.8 million people who live in the Gaza Strip once we've finished burying our dead from that operation? Big
you want to take that question?
You have to take into consideration that Netanyahu's one of Netanyahu's most vulnerable points is the ongoing security situation in the south, the fact that settlements there, villages and towns have been subjected to rocket attacks. But this is part of Netanyahu's ideology. Netanyahu does not want the Hamas to fall. He wants Hamas he doesn't want them to thrive and prosper, but he wants them to survive in Gaza, because in that way he splits apart the Palestinian people, and he faces less pressure to reach an agreement which he doesn't want to reach. First of all, the Kahol Lavan would not have this kind of ideology, and I think that given the opportunity, they would gladly hand back Gaza to the Palestinian Authority, which Netanyahu would never do. And yes, I think it's true that given their nature and given what we know about how leftist or center-left prime ministers and ministers of defense react, they react with much greater force than right-wingers do. And to Netanyahu's credits, he has kept the Gaza campaign on low flames. I think that I think we should be prepared that if they come to power, we will see, on the one hand, an acceleration and an escalation of the kind of retaliation that Israel carries out, but also renewed efforts to try to alleviate the humanitarian situation. And if it ever reaches a situation where Hamas could be thrown out, they would do it. One of the reasons that Netanyahu is against an all-out incursion into Gaza is that he doesn't know what he would do with Gaza once we assume
Right.
the IDF takes over. I think Gantz and they would have less of a problem. They would give Gaza to international supervision. They would give Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. It's only Netanyahu who would like the Hamas to rule Gaza in perpetuity.
Yeah, but Hamas and Netanyahu are basically, each other's best friends in terms of interest-wise. Obviously not in terms
They
of
have shared interests.
Shared interests. But Netanyahu has been doing plenty of saber rattling in the last few days, and he has all but stated outright that after the election, he keeps saying, on our time, when the time is right for us, there's going to be a major operation in Gaza, and it's not clear to any of us if this is campaign rhetoric or if he really means it.
Well, other than when we look at his campaign promise in 2009,
that he was going to finish off
once
Hamas.
elected, he's going to finish them off.
Yeah, and as Chemi's already said, we're in election season, so we take everything with a little pinch of salt.
Big
pinch of
bag of
salt.
salt.
Big bags of salt.
Okay, Jack Green has sent in a question, and he, I think, has been reading Noah Landau's analysis in today's newspaper. He wants to know whether Trump is helping or hurting Bibi during the past couple of weeks of the campaign. On the one hand, making overtures to Iran. On the other hand, talking about a mutual defense treaty with Israel. So is he doing him more harm or more good, Allison?
Well, he sort of did some harm, and now he's trying to make up for it by doing some good with this tweet about this mutual defense treaty that maybe we'll talk about after the election. That, as many analysts have already pointed out, is something that Netanyahu himself has opposed in the past. So he's made a gesture, which was important, because if Trump did nothing to blatantly try to help Netanyahu, that would have sent a big signal, because he's been so obvious about pushing for Netanyahu in the past.
Right.
But what he's offered is presumably less than what he could have offered. I would think that the real obvious gift he could have given to Netanyahu is if he had somehow offered some words of support for Netanyahu's declaration that he plans to annex the Jordan Valley.
Right,
if he
which
had
was
even
met by deafening silence from Washington.
Absolutely. If he'd even nodded in approval in that direction, that would have been a much bigger gift to Netanyahu than what he did. So he's helping a little, but not that much. On the other hand, a lot of people, they look at the past record, they look at the embassy being moved, they look at the Golan Heights, etc. So there have been a lot of gifts under the Christmas tree.
But what have you done for me lately? It's probably what Netanyahu is going to ask.
Exactly.
Right?
Depends if you're thinking short term or long term.
Right. Chemi, is there a sense that Trump's image has slightly been tarnished in Israel by Netanyahu embracing him so closely? Netanyahu's put up big posters of himself shaking hands with Trump and saying a different league, we're in a league of our own. Is this working slightly against Netanyahu?
I don't think so. I think that Trump is still very popular in Israel, and I think a lot of people who vote Likud are doing so because they claim to believe Netanyahu when he says, I'm the only one who can. Well, today he said stop Trump, which was a very strange statement. But I think a lot of people think that his relationship with Trump and with Putin and with all sorts of other world leaders, usually on the authoritarian side of things, is a positive, and that he's a professional and works in his favor. And I also think that there's a frost this time that didn't exist in April 9th. And the reason is Trump's overtures to Iran, which fly in the face and totally upend Netanyahu's strategy towards Iran. And his main effort now is to try to prevent all of this to prevent the Israeli public from realizing that his grand Iran strategy is going off the rails. And it's also true, I think, that Trump has been stingier this time. And I think that Allison is right in the sense that what he was doing yesterday was trying to make up for the damage that he has caused. And it was very eerie that last week that on every day, usually immediately after Netanyahu made his some press conference or something, Trump issued a statement on meeting Rouhani, on taking down sanctions, on that seemed to undercut, so that if you're a suspicious character, you might think that Trump actually is no longer enamored with Netanyahu. I don't think we can go that far, but there is a tension today that we haven't seen, and if Netanyahu is reelected, the tension will escalate if Trump indeed goes and meets Rouhani.
Do we know where this tension's coming from?
tension is coming from that he's gone off the script, Trump.
But he's done so knowingly. He's done so knowing that what he's going to be doing.
He's done so knowingly because he's got
Netanyahu.
it's not because of Netanyahu. He's got his own agenda. He's
desperately looking at 2020.
Exactly. He's desperately seeking an achievement. He's run into dead ends on all sorts of other, and I think he understands. If this is my own personal speculation, he understands the Iranian problem as an issue of a transactional issue. And he's the ultimate negotiator. And I even think he's challenged by the possibility of confronting the greatest, people who are stereotyped as the greatest negotiator. And in any case, as we found out in June, he does not want war. Right. And the Iranians know he does not want war. And this undermined the whole logic of Netanyahu's strategy, which was to make the Iranians believe that Trump is willing to go to war.
Right.
So, yeah.
But after that, and after obviously the dismissal of John Bolton, which was another blow to Netanyahu, I think that today's news shows a little bit of a boost to the anti-Iran factions, and that the attack by the Yemenite Houthis against Saudi Arabia have gotten the Saudis really upset about Iran. So the question is, can Trump, or will Trump continue to go in a pro-Iran or gestures towards Iran direction if he's got both the Saudis and Netanyahu pushing him in the other direction?
Well, the White House did issue a statement saying that this does not affect Trump's plans to meet Rouhani, but it's true, it's absolutely true, that if the Saudis now join Netanyahu in pressing Trump not to go ahead, he'll feel more pressure. But they walk a fine line, because if Trump gets wind even of the things that have already been said here, leaks from the prime minister and things said by ministers, that he's being criticized, he doesn't react well to criticism. And so things could go downhill if he feels that Israel and Netanyahu are not being appreciative enough of the help and the assistance and the gestures that he's made so far.
Right. Well, Netanyahu works very hard to keep all of that shut down, right?
A question from someone calling themselves a big fan from LA. Thank
we
you,
like
big
him already.
Would like 2 words, ideally stuff that we can publish on the internet, about Ayelet Shaked. Her role in this election, I'm assuming, what she's going to do, where she's positioning herself. She also came out over the weekend and spoke about Trump's peace plan, which she claimed that would divide Jerusalem. It's nice to see her recycling old election slogans, at least. 2 words about Ayelet Shaked? 2 clean words?
At the moment, very desperate.
Yeah.
Very desperate. She has gone on the air, and this is completely, it's the most non-Ayelet Shaked thing you can imagine, because she is, full of projecting confidence and everything's fine and I'm strong and everything's great. And she has, against her sort of own nature, had to basically take to the airwaves and, as they say, a Gewalt campaign. This is what they call it here, and help us. That she is saying, my party, my Yamina right-wing party, is going to be wiped out by Netanyahu aggressively going after our voters and trying to bring every right-wing vote, religious or not religious, into the Likud. And so at the moment she's very desperate, and the whole switch of having Ayelet Shaked at the head of the party instead of Naftali Bennett, they basically switched places 1 and 2. Her strategy was supposed to capitalize on her popularity and be able to keep the voter base of Yamina, to resist this last-minute drain by the Likud, but it doesn't seem to be working out for her.
Well, she just had on the way over, she had a press conference or an appearance, I don't know, in which she showed the same desperation, but she went further, because for the first time, she didn't mention Sarah Netanyahu by name, but she did everything else. She addressed the elephant in the room, which is that one of the main sources of the tension between her and Netanyahu, and the reason that she's not a senior member of the Likud right now, is because of the fact that the prime minister's wife can't stand her, and if the prime minister's wife doesn't like somebody, then that person is more or less finished in terms of the Likud. And the fact that she has kept completely silent about this, even despite press reports, and the fact that she's now bringing it out, using it as a way of trying to woo back voters that may have drifted off to the Likud, is a sign that she's indeed desperate, and that I don't think there's any danger right now that Yamina would not pass the threshold but it is going down. There is a danger that it would go down to the numbers like 5, 6, 7 that would make it insignificant unless it is the party that holds the balance of power, which could happen.
Yeah. The question is, are these votes from Yamina being taken only by Likud, or are they also moving rightwards to the Kahanist Otzma Yisrael party, and what will it mean if those two parties get in, as that's another party that would recommend Netanyahu for prime minister?
Well, if Otzma gets in, as we all know, and I'm sure our viewers also know, that would be a revolution, a sea change. Absolutely. It would be a dramatic, and if they are in a position to dictate terms that would allow Netanyahu to get his immunity, then I think we can look forward to things and demands and concessions that we've never seen before. And
look forward is not the way I put it. But
well, we're journalists, so we're also looking forward.
Yeah.
And for me, the biggest question of the elections is, will Otzma pass or not pass? If Otzma passes, and especially if it gives Netanyahu 61, we are in a radical right. And if it doesn't pass, and therefore Netanyahu doesn't get a 61, we are on the center right in one way or another. And in terms of the future of democracy and religion and state, it's black and white.
But Netanyahu has made the decision to run against Otzma Yisrael and not to try to get them in, but to take away their votes and bring them to the Likud.
I find that decision very curious, given that all of the polls, although he claims that his polls are not so, emphatic. Given that all of the polls are showing that they are passing the threshold, he is risking taking away the very votes that would allow them to pass the threshold. Yeah. So it's a very dicey policy.
I wonder if he fears of having them in his coalition will somehow delegitimize his government internationally, et cetera, if he worries about the stigma or the stain about Otzma Yisrael. Obviously, if they made him continue to be prime minister and got him over 61, that's his priority. But I wonder if any part of him has misgivings about what that would signal to the world and how it could, delegitimize his government.
I think not.
Okay.
Given that he is the one who legitimized Otzma in the first place by, before the April 9th elections, insisting that the Ichud party, the predecessor of Yamina, of Sheket's Yamina, include them in their list, while before they were sort of outcast by the entire political community. He's the last one to, worry about whether, what sort of an impression their participation would make on the world. And I don't think it bothers him very much. I think it would have bothered him 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think today he is so focused on his single aim in life, which is to get 61 votes, with all of what that means, that if he was told this is what's going to make the difference, he would not be behaving the way he is now. But he seems to think that despite the polls, they are not going to pass the threshold. And I think he's basing himself, among other things, on the experience we had with Moshe Feiglin in the last, who had 7 seats, according to the polls, a week, and wound up with nothing. And he's concerned that it's the same, that people are telling pollsters they're voting for Otzma because they're angry at something or somebody, but when they're inside the polling booth, they're not going to vote that way.
It's different this time. I think Feiglin won a lot of votes because of his marijuana legalization promise. Otzma Yehudit is not exactly promising that.
No.
But Borei Minei Samim is one thing.
They're high on something else, right?
Speaking of things that we're not looking forward to, we have a question from Sally in New York, who reminds us that Yossi Werter said that we may find ourselves in a gridlock nightmare on Tuesday night. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts. How long could this gridlock go on for? How can we get out of it? What are we going to do? We can't have another election, surely.
Gridlock means that Netanyahu did not get the 61 votes. Now, that, as we said, that doesn't necessarily mean that Benny Gantz can set up a government. But I think that once Netanyahu, as I said, once Netanyahu cannot set up his dream coalition, then we're in uncharted waters, and it's very hard to predict how things will go. I believe, I may be naive, that indeed Netanyahu say he wants to go for new elections again. I think he'll find it much more difficult than he did last time. That's a one-trick pony. No, yeah, that was it. I don't think it's going to happen again. I don't think
that was legal but dirty.
Yeah, that was what they say in Hebrew: kosher but smelly, but stinking.
Right.
Yeah.
And and we don't think that Rivlin or the President Rivlin will let him do that again, right?
I don't think the parties will let him do it. I don't think the parties that are party to his coalition, I don't think they won't play along this time.
How can they stop it?
They just won't vote for it.
Yeah, they
won't
had to give
vote
up
to
his
disperse the
coalition.
Knesset
Yeah,
again.
his coalition had to willingly disperse themselves, and if they don't refuse to do it again, it can't happen again. In which case, they'll just have to keep persisting until somebody gets a majority coalition.
And I'll tell you another thing that's going to happen. Last time, Rivlin, I think, was so taken aback, and he said he was surprised, by Netanyahu's decision not to hand over the mandate to Benny Gantz as he's supposed to, according to the law, that he was sort of paralyzed. That's not going to happen this time. The moment, on the second that Bibi's mandate is up, and way before he can, get Parliament, he's going to give it to Benny Gantz. Rivlin is going to do whatever he can. He doesn't have that much authority to try and prevent it. But as I said, I don't think he will garner 61 votes for a third election within a year. I don't think that's possible.
But if it's close, we're not going to know anything very soon because there has to be the whole process of recommendations. Who's going to recommend who? We're going to have to go through that first, and then this whole procedure will start. So we're looking.
And we're coming up to the Jewish high holidays.
Yeah, another reason to postpone everything.
Everything gets postponed and put
Yeah.
on ice for a few weeks. So this could drag on. And
drag on.
and
Yeah,
on.
but if you think about it, we've been in election mode since last December.
That's
This could
right.
be a whole year of national paralysis because of elections.
Right. Well, it's good for us.
For journalists.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Plenty to write
about. Not good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We seem to have pressed a couple of buttons with our talk about Trump. Linda Gold wants somebody to please explain to her why the American president is so popular within the Likud. And does Bibi himself not realize that the problem that Trump is causing for diaspora Jews and American Jews in particular?
Not just within the Likud, within the entire Israeli population, right? Not only Likudniks love Donald Trump. Chemi, do you want to explain why?
I think it's quite. I was drinking the Insider.
Yeah.
I think it's quite obvious. Trump has stopped all U.S. criticism of Israeli policies. There is no more criticism of Israeli policies.
Proportional response.
Which no White House, which no White House has ever.
From within the White House.
From the American
the whole
government.
administration,
Right,
State Department.
right.
That has never happened in the past. And it stands in stark contrast to what Israelis perceived of Barack Obama, and especially as he ended his tenure with the Security Council condemnation of which the U.S. abstained on. And he's made these so-called historic gestures of moving the embassy and recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. And he has, up until now it's weakening, but he has left the Iran deal, which I think Netanyahu succeeded in persuading most Israelis was a bad deal.
Right.
And so there is no reason for Israelis not to like Donald Trump. And if we go back to how Americans, or a large part of Americans, perceive him, one, I think Israelis, they don't think it's their business what he does in internal U.S. politics. And
Even
two,
when it comes to the Jewish population of
I'll get to the Jews. And two, I think a lot of the traits, unfortunately, traits that Trump shows that some Americans detest are actually appreciated by Israelis. The chutzpah, what we call the dugri, where blunt talk,
Plain spoken.
his opposition to political correctness, the fact that he's so disdainful of these are all things that speak to the Israeli persona, and so I think it's natural. And it would be weird if most Israelis didn't, given what they know from their prime minister, it would be strange to expect Israelis to oppose Trump. I would be much happier if we were less enthusiastic about it, but that's the situation.
When I try to explain it to my American friends, usually over drinks or in some sort of casual situation, I try them, because there are many thinking, smart Israelis who look at Donald Trump and they know who he is and they understand him for what he is and they see what he's doing inside the United States, and yet they see what he's done for Israel in terms of policy, moving the embassy, Golan Heights, etc., the lack of criticism, etc. And I tell them, imagine you have a really crazy uncle who lives across the world, and you hear the things that he says and you can't believe it and he's outrageous, etc. But he continues to keep depositing, $500,000 in your bank account every 6 months. He sends you a Mercedes. He, sends you on a trip around the world. It's very hard to trash talk the person who keeps making gestures in your direction, even though he may not be your cup of tea as a human being.
And
Also, Trump is allowing Israelis to adhere to their dream of having their cake and eating it, meaning having an occupation, but not being aware of it, not being forced to give up territories, sort of maintaining the status quo indefinitely. Not even that. According to what Netanyahu says, Trump will allow Israel to annex territories.
Right.
Another thing that would be unthinkable under any previous administration.
Republican or Democrat.
Republican or Democrat. So if you're a lefty, maybe you're not happy with all of this. But if you're not a lefty and you're anything else, he's like a dream come true,
a very sweet
or a nightmare
dream,
come true for others. But
Yeah.
for many Israelis, a dream come true.
Absolutely. Okay, I think that's it. We're out of time. Chemi Shalev, Allison Kaplan, Sommer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you to subscribers. Shana Tova from Tel Aviv, and we'll be back again sometime next month.
Cider.
L'chaim.
Chaim.
L'chaim.
Hi. Akol b'cider.
Cheers.